this is what I thought was really interesting in your chapter, is that you talk about his concept of cognitive activity. And you make this argument that for him, the aim or purpose or goal of our cognitive activities are to pursue wisdom. And I found that really interesting. So could you kind of unpack this idea and explain this for us?
Yeah, I've been working on this notion that Ephrem is really interested in the pursuit of wisdom almost since the beginning of my academic career. In the very first article that I published after the dissertation, and the more I read him, the more I find the traces of this. So it's really about connecting the dots between lots of little bits of imagery in his writings. So I'll try to kind of outline some of those the big features. They're not necessarily in a linear order here, but just what's the constellation or the network of references to wisdom in Ephrem's writings. One of the most important points, one of the anchor points for this is Adam himself, the forefather of the human race, right? Adam is described by Ephrem in his commentary on Genesis, which is a prose work, I should mention, as being made for wisdom. And this is really interesting because when Ephrem then comments on Adam as why does God make Adam? I mean, part of his original endowment, it's really it's three things. Okay, it's life, immortal life. Okay, it's wisdom, and it is the state of perceiving the majesty of God. And all these things go together because the life of the human being is nurtured by the perception of the majesty of God, which is the origin of wisdom. And now what's interesting about this is then that Ephrem connects Adam's wisdom, his endowment of wisdom. He describes Adam in what we might call Mosaic language. So he borrows language from Moses's transfiguration on Sinai in Exodus 34:29. Where Moses goes up and he's in the presence of God, and because he sees the light of glory, what happens to Moses is his being transfigured, and Ephrem will actually describe Adam in these very terms, but it's precisely that sort of elevated status of being transfigured. Ephrem takes that as a mark of wisdom, and he does this also. So Adam's described in Mosaic terms. You could say Moses is described in Adamic terms, but Adam is also, or Moses is also described in Danielic terms. I'm thinking of the prophet Daniel, right? And Daniel, of course, is famous for his wisdom. In fact, he's so famous for his wisdom that he beat the sages of Chaldea, right, at their own game, as it were. Like he was wiser than the wise of Nebuchadnezzar. And so for Ephrem, the sort of biblical paradigm for wisdom is Moses, the one who has the Torah, and Daniel, who was wiser than any of the prophets, and he'll actually reference the prayer in Daniel 2, Daniel's prayer for wisdom, as in kind of Mosaic and Adamic terms, always in terms of the light. So we've got these sort of what you might call biblical paradigms that show to Ephrem that man is made for wisdom. And now here's the important thing about this, right? What all these three figures have in common is that the path to wisdom is, according to Ephrem's interpretation, is the perception of the divine majesty, which requires self-discipline. It requires asceticism. Okay, and what's interesting about this is that tracks very well with how late antique philosophers thought about philosophy as a way of life. That the pursuit of wisdom is not just about acquiring information. God is not acquired by us as information, but he is encountered as transfiguration. And so it's that being transfigured by the light of divine glory leading to wisdom and sort of this comprehensive view that Ephrem has in mind. But it also is very much in keeping with the ideals of Pierre Hadot talks about late ancient philosophers treating philosophy as a way of life. So I'm thinking of people like Plotinus, but he's just one example among the Hellenistic philosophical tradition. Now, of course, people are going to say, well, wait a minute now. But the philosophers are using a different approach to get to wisdom, and than Ephrem is, and then these biblical characters are. Well, yeah, maybe, right? So you might think that, but only if you have the idea that there's sort of this faith versus reason attitude. And to be perfectly honest, I'll put all my cards on the table. I don't think any of the church fathers, even the more rationalistic ones, actually thought in terms of faith and reason as their sort of primary paradigm for this. Like you'll get it later, of course, in the Middle Ages for sure, and you get some of this in maybe Augustine or something like that. But it's not really. It becomes the dominant paradigm later because of medieval developments in Western universities and because of the debate with Islam and things like that. But in this early time, it's not really a faith reason paradigm that is. I'm not poo-pooing that paradigm. I just want to point out I don't think it's the paradigm that many of the fathers have in mind, and certainly it's not the paradigm that Ephrem has. So they're not so worried about how you get your wisdom as the fact that you get your wisdom, right? And that you live the life that pursues it by whatever means that it makes sense to do so, and that includes asceticism, right? The sort of disciplining of the self, fasting especially, and that fasting is actually something that sharpens perception, so that we can be ready for the reception of divine wisdom. But it isn't just a matter of waiting around for God to, if you just pray and you fast a whole bunch, then all of a sudden God's going to illuminate you. Well, yes, but Ephrem says this very interesting thing in one of his treatments of the matter, which really shows that he views this as kind of a synergy, to borrow a later Greek term from the fathers, a synergy of human and divine action, right, working together. He talks about this pursuit of wisdom as involving investigation. And that's, of course, the thing that everybody thinks that Ephrem is so opposed to. But it really depends on how that kind of on where that investigation is directed, and it really depends on the will, right? So I'm going to read this little passage, which kind of shows what Ephrem's ideal is for the proper operating of the human pursuit of wisdom. And this comes from his Hymns on Paradise, which is, if anybody's never read St Ephrem, that's the place to start, is to read the Hymns on Paradise, translated by Sebastian Brock. But with that in mind, let's Hymns on Paradise 12. Ephrem's reflecting on Adam and the two trees in paradise. God situated two trees in paradise, a tree of life and another tree of wisdom, a pair of blessed wellsprings of every good thing. Pause for a second and realize the tree of knowledge of good and evil is not bad for Ephrem. In fact, it's an essential part of what Adam is supposed to have had. They are both, the tree of life and the tree of wisdom are the wellsprings of all good things. So it would be hard to get a more comprehensive statement than this, right? In these two glorious realities, a person can become the likeness of God via life without death and wisdom without error. So this is how you become like God. It's through wisdom, right? So what's theosis for Ephrem? Well, it involves wisdom, right? Now, this is where it gets interesting. That outer knowledge that God gave to him, by which he called Eve and the animals by their names, did not reveal to him the discoveries of hidden things. So there's a sort of gift of knowledge. But here's the key thing. Adam, as philosopher, if I may be so bold as to say so, right? God did not reveal to Adam the discoveries of hidden things. Rather, he was capable of comprehending that concealed knowledge from the celestial bodies downwards. That is, the investigating of all the things that exist within the world. And the very word that he uses is basatha, the very thing that he criticizes among the heretics. So the point is that Adam's capacities were meant to be developed in what I think could fairly be described as in a philosophical manner, right? And this is essential to his vocation. Now, Adam, of course, by choosing the tree of knowledge with a bad with a disordered will, right? Taking it before it was, he uses the image of, it's like a fruit that's not ripe yet. So you take it before it's ripe, it proves deadly to you, right? But in due time, it was to have been taken, right? And the failure of Adam was a failure of discipline. It was a failure in his fasting. It was a failure in his asceticism, right? If he had just prayed and fasted for the amount of time required to mature, he would have been able to take the, and of course Ephrem is seeing this in very symbolic terms, but you put that together with the passage which I just quoted from the 12th hymn on paradise, and you realize, oh, wait a minute, Ephrem thinks that man is made for wisdom, and not only made just to kind of be the passive recipient of divine illumination, but actually made to be the active investigator of the wondrous things that God has made. And I mean, it's not, I described Ephrem earlier as a theologian of wonder. Well, let's not forget that the classical philosophers said that philosophy begins in wonder, right? So I think there's a in terms of the purpose of the human being, a profound alignment between Ephrem's vision of what the sort of the original state of man was to have been, and what is recovered in theosis, a profound alignment between that and the quests of the philosophers. What he critiques about them is their disordered desire for knowledge. And so one of the things that helps me explain this is I quoted at the beginning the blessed is he who has not tasted the poison of the wisdom of the Greeks. In another one of his writings that very few people have actually paid enough attention to, Ephrem will later say something very similar. He'll talk about poison, and he'll talk about investigation and so forth, but he's more specific. He's a little bit more precise in this other poem. And he talks about investigation, or not investigation, excuse me. He says, dialectic without measure is poisonous. But so that's that. I use that as sort of the key to interpret the other passage and think the issue is dispute, debate, right? So he has in mind a particular mode of philosophical discourse, which if you do it without measure, you try to apply it to the wrong thing, namely to the divine mystery, where it doesn't work, right? That's when it becomes deadly to you, just as it was deadly to Adam, right? And that just like Adam eats the fruit of wisdom with disordered desire, and it becomes deadly to him. I think Ephrem sees that same paradigm unfolding in his own day in the heretics who are pursuing knowledge, but doing it in a way which is intemperate, right? So they don't have the necessary temperance, they don't have the necessary asceticism. So once you start to piece the imagery together in Ephrem's poetry, you realize that his whole worldview is about the pursuit of wisdom, and that this is one of the original endowments of man that God wanted man to have, and that man was supposed to actively exercise. And it goes astray, not because of the pursuit of wisdom, but because of the disordered desire that causes that desire causes that pursuit of wisdom to run wild like a beast, actually. So it becomes inhuman as a result of that failure of temperance. And to be more concrete about it, right? I think it's a kind of presumption, right, against God that Ephrem finds so problematic. So.
This is interesting, because I was listening to what you're saying. This actually sounds very similar to what St. John of Damascus says at the opening of his great treatise on the Orthodox faith, in which he talks about we have this unique capacity as human beings to pursue knowledge, to pursue wisdom, and if we don't nurture that, he's very negative about that. Like we're unique because we have the potential to do this. And if we don't nurture it, then we're almost like allowing ourselves to be degraded like some kind of lower being who doesn't have that. And that sounds very similar to what you're describing here. Yeah.
And Ephrem will talk about this in other passages. The sort of failure to perceive our own dignity as human causes us to sink to the level of the beast. So a lot of his language for sort of intellectuality gone astray is language of the beasts, right? He thinks of Nebuchadnezzar, he thinks of Adam sort of degrading his status to that of the beasts. He thinks of he has a lot of fun with Balaam and his ass in Genesis, and how we've got this talking ass that basically is wiser than the prophet, so he does this kind of thing a lot, actually. And there are other passages in Ephrem's writings that I didn't mention. The hymns on the pearl are a really great example. He really presents the pursuit of wisdom, or presents the metaphor of the pearl of great price, like that quest for the pearl, as a sort of way of describing the pursuit of wisdom, right? So there's so many different literary and metaphorical angles on this, that once you realize that it's a theme in his writings, you start to see it cropping up everywhere. And he'll and then it makes sense of why he'll do some interesting connections. Like he'll connect the pursuit of the pearl. He starts his hymns on the pearl by thinking about the pearl of great price in the Gospels, but he ends up connecting it to the Queen of Sheba and to Solomon. And you might think, well, why is he's relying on some verbal cues in the biblical text, but the reason he's doing it is the more important, more interesting thing. And that is that, of course, what's Solomon known for is his wisdom. And why does the Queen of Sheba come to him, right? And so, like, he's basically, at any chance he gets, he's connecting these biblical images together in a way that foregrounds the pursuit of wisdom. So it's very biblical.
Yeah.
It's very ascetical. It's very interested in the kind of ascetical dimension of the pursuit of wisdom.
Right.
But when you ask him, when he has occasion to reflect on it, he'll emphasize two things. He'll emphasize that there is appropriate place for investigation, provided it's balanced, right? And he'll emphasize that it takes place, that it is not disembodied, right? It must be corporeal. It must begin in the senses. And in this way, I think he's actually, there's kind of a classical position as it develops in the Christian tradition about knowledge beginning in the senses. Ephrem would absolutely insist upon it, right? Like to try to have knowledge of God apart from the sensate media through which he grants it to us is lunacy and presumption.
Well, that is actually the perfect segue into this final thing I want to talk to you about. So, part of what we were trying to accomplish in this book, Eastern Christian Approaches to Philosophy, was to try to bring Eastern Christian thinkers into conversation with contemporary philosophers. And so you had quite the task in your chapter. You were not only trying to show us that no, St. Ephrem wasn't just a raging anti-intellectual, and you were also trying to explain what you just talked about, this idea that the pursuit of wisdom is central to his conception of the purpose of human existence. But then you actually were then trying to connect some of his discussion on sensation and perception and these cognitive, activities. You were trying to connect that to something in contemporary philosophy. So, although we're getting a little close to the end here, could you tell us a little bit about this?
Yeah, so now I must say that I hope Marshall McLuhan doesn't mind my using him as an example of philosopher, because I'm not sure he would have accepted the label. He was, McLuhan is kind of an enigmatic figure. I think it's fair to say, if people don't know much about him. He was a Canadian. He basically invented the field of media ecology. He was a Canadian scholar who got really interested in the notion of what media do to us and what we do with media, and the role of technology in that progression. But what few people know about McLuhan is that he actually was a Catholic and Thomist. He corresponded with Jacques Matthan, and he has, even in maybe perhaps he wouldn't like to be called a philosopher, but he has some pretty interesting philosophical reflections on media and technology. And so, if you've never read McLuhan before, the thing you should know about McLuhan, like to sum up, this is probably unfair to do it, but in the interest of time, I'm going to sum him up in this way. I say McLuhan's basic insight was that we shape our tools. And he's talking about technology, and then our tools in turn shape us. And what he means by that shaping is that they shape our perceptions. So the media environment plays an important role in shaping how we see things, how we perceive, not just see, but how we perceive things, right? All the senses are involved. Sight, hearing, touch, right? And he sees this is something really important that nobody's attending to, and that's why he was led to found this whole like realm of study. So when I sat down to try to connect McLuhan and Ephrem, there were a couple of things that I noticed that seemed to be shared between them, and that's what I explored in the article or the chapter. One of these things that so McLuhan really emphasizes in general the importance of sensation, right? That this is really actually his whole account of media is rooted in what do they do to our senses, and in shaping new media, how is our sensation shaped? So McLuhan, like Ephrem, would, I think, be very insistent that knowledge begins in the senses. But once you realize that both Ephrem and McLuhan share a real interest in the senses, because so for Ephrem, the key thing is that the senses, the body, is essential to the soul functioning, right? And he even holds a kind of radical view that others would later regard as heretical, that the soul, because the soul cannot enter into paradise in its disembodied state, actually has to sleep and wait until the final resurrection and the day of judgment before it can enter paradise. So he had the theory of soul sleep, is what it's sometimes called. And he insists that the soul without the body is like an embryo. It can't function. It can't do anything. It's deaf. It's blind. It's dumb. And for Ephrem, speech is one of the senses. It's important to point out. Okay. And McLuhan would actually have a similar attitude towards anything that pertains to both speech and hearing and sight and so forth. So they both have expansive understandings of what it means to sense something. So that's all kind of by way of background, that they both recognize the importance of the senses. Then there are two themes in McLuhan that find echoes in Ephrem. And one of the things that McLuhan, in some of his writings on religion, emphasized was what we could call the primacy of the percept. He had a real problem with philosophers and actually with theologians more particular, and he connected them to the Pharisees. And the reason he did that was because he said they're basically just playing intellectual conceptual games. If it's not grounded in the percept, the concepts are just, well, playing around, fooling around. And in some of his interviews collected in a book called The Medium and the Light, he talks about this. And this is for him why it's so important that the word becomes flesh in the incarnation, right? That the percept is the important thing. And that concepts apart from percepts are basically vanity and a chasing after the wind. And so we can find this same attitude in Ephrem, right? The problem with the heretics is that they're not paying attention to the percepts of salvation history. They're not paying, and what I mean by that is they're not paying attention to the symbolism, the sacramental dimension of salvation history. They're not paying attention to the ways in which the mystery is being presented to us by the divine artist for us to actually literally perceive it and taste it, right? In the Eucharist, for example, right? Then there's another feature of McLuhan's work that I found to be very interesting, and that is McLuhan seemed to think that artists had a really important role. So McLuhan's concern was that because we don't pay attention to the effects of the media environment on our abilities to perceive, we become numb. And the only way to overcome this numbness is to be more attentive to the perceptual life and the perceptual process itself. And McLuhan thinks that artists of all types, visual artists, perhaps especially, but literary artists as well, anybody who could lay claim to being an artist, has this unique awareness of the importance of perceptual life and perceptual activity that allows the artist to kind of see what's coming in the changes in media and the media environment, and allow us to sort of to escape a little bit from the numbness that we would ordinarily be subject to as a result of our inattentiveness to the effects of media upon our senses. And it's interesting that Ephrem does insist that the best way to do theology is through poetry. And he seems to have this understanding that it is in the artistic sort of life, as it were, and the life of the artist, you actually have this ability to perceive. It becomes, I guess you could say, an antidote to the Pharisaical primacy of the concept, because what the artistry of theological poetry enables for Ephrem is it really drags us back to paying attention to the things that God wants us to perceive, to the perceptual life, the life of the sacraments, the life of the what he called the rase in Syriac. These are the word. It's like the Greek word mysterion, and just like the Greek word mysterion, it means, it's not exactly the same thing as the Greek word, but it just like that, it refers both to divine mysteries, but also to the holy sacraments, right? To the sacramental life of the church, her liturgical life, all those things, and so I think Ephrem. One of the things I've always asked myself is, why did Ephrem find it so important to write poetry as his means of theological expression? He tended to argue that you couldn't do theology very well except in poetry. And I think the reason is because of this McLuhan-esque appreciation for the primacy of the percept, right? It's this that actually gives us an asceticism of the senses. Or Paul Evdokimov had once talked about icons requiring a fasting for the eyes. And Ephrem would totally endorse that idea, that our eyes have to fast in order to see right. And I think his poetry, with all of its interesting quirks and its, it forces you to perceive in a certain way that is a disciplining of our perceptions, particularly of our spiritual, but also physical sight. And so I think that, in a nutshell, McLuhan emphasizes the importance of disciplining the senses so that they can function properly, and artistry plays a key role in the disciplining of the senses. I think Ephrem, I think that's what he and Ephrem have in common. Ephrem would say the same thing, that we need to discipline the senses in order that they might be open to the wellspring of wonder.
Well, Andrew, that's so fascinating. I think we could probably sit here and talk about that for like another hour. But I really enjoyed getting to be a part of just, watching you write this chapter and then reading the different drafts and then the final product. And thank you so much for joining me today to talk about it and share this with the world. And I really appreciate it.
The pleasure is all mine.
Hopefully we can have you back one day.
Inshallah, God willing.
All right. Well, take care, Andrew.
Take care.